It was 7:33 a.m. over the Barents Sea, and the sky above the Arctic Circle in late October was doing what Arctic skies do in late October, pressing down hard from the north in a flat, gray ceiling that sat at 4,000 feet and made the horizon disappear into the same uniform color as the sea below it. The water was steel gray and running in heavy swells from a northwest gale that had been building for 18 hours, 12-foot seas with white caps, the kind of conditions that make flight operations from a carrier deck a genuine test of seamanship and airmanship simultaneously. The temperature at the surface was 4 degrees Celsius. At altitude, where the ceiling ended and the sky opened into clear, bitter Arctic air above the overcast, it was considerably colder. Cold enough that the exhaust plumes of aircraft flying above the cloud deck were visible for miles as brilliant white contrails against the dark blue of the upper atmosphere. Cold enough that any crew that ejected into the Barents Sea had, at best, minutes before the cold water made further survival decisions unnecessary. USS Harry S. Truman, CVN 75, had entered the Norwegian Sea from the North Atlantic 6 days earlier and had been operating in the Barents Sea for the past 31 hours, the most northerly penetration by an American carrier strike group in the post-Cold War era, a deliberate, authorized, and strategically significant operation designed to demonstrate that the United States Navy's ability to project power into what Russia considers its strategic maritime backyard had not diminished in the 30 years since the Soviet Union's collapse. The Barents Sea is Russia's most sensitive naval operating area. The Northern Fleet's ballistic missile submarines, the backbone of Russia's nuclear deterrent, operate from bases on the Kola Peninsula, less than 400 nautical miles from where the Truman was currently operating. Russian naval aviation has patrolled this water for decades, with the specific mission of finding and tracking American carriers. The Truman's presence here was not provocative in the legal sense. These were international waters. It was provocative in the strategic sense, which was precisely the point. Carrier Strike Group 8 had configured for the Arctic threat environment with the specificity of a command that had studied Russian naval aviation doctrine for 30 years and understood exactly what the Barents Sea operating area required. USS Normandy, CG-60, the Ticonderoga-class guided missile cruiser, led the formation with 122 vertical launch system cells loaded with a mix weighted toward the long-range air defense mission. SM-6 dual-role interceptors, SM-2 Block 3B, and ESSM Block 2 quad-packed for inner layer defense against the saturation attack profiles that Russian naval aviation doctrine prescribes. 3 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, USS Forrest Sherman, USS Farragut, and USS Bulkley, held screening positions around the carrier. And above the overcast, 2 E-2D Advanced Hawkeyes were flying simultaneous orbits in a coordinated pattern that gave the strike group overlapping radar coverage from the Norwegian coast to the Novaya Zemlya archipelago, a surveillance picture extending 300 nautical miles into Russian maritime airspace that saw everything the Russian Navy flew from the moment it lifted off any airfield on the Kola Peninsula. The Russian Navy's strike aviation regiments operating from Olenya Air Base near Murmansk had been watching the Truman's approach for 5 days. The Tu-22M3 Backfire, the supersonic variable sweep maritime strike bomber that is the Northern Fleet's primary anti-carrier weapon, had been flying surveillance missions around the strike group's operating area since the Truman entered the Norwegian Sea. The Backfire crews knew the carrier's approximate position. The Northern Fleet's surface ships and submarines had been building a targeting picture. The operational planning that culminated in the order issued at 6:47 a.m. on this day had been in preparation for at least 48 hours. At 7:19 a.m., 14 minutes before this story's opening moment, the Northern E-2D crew registered multiple contacts climbing out of the cloud layer 220 nautical miles to the northeast. Contacts that had originated, the track reconstruction would later confirm, from Olenya Air Base, flying low under the radar horizon for as long as the terrain permitted before climbing to strike altitude over the Barents Sea. The contacts were large. Their radar cross-sections were consistent with heavy aircraft. Their speed, climbing through 600 knots at 7:21 a.m., and their formation spread were consistent with a coordinated strike package. The E-2D crew classified them at 7:22 a.m. Tu-22M3 Backfire, 6 aircraft minimum, bearing northeast, range 210 nautical miles, inbound on a bearing that placed the Truman's position directly on their projected track. 6 Tu-22M3 Backfire bombers, inbound at supersonic speed from the northeast. The contact count updated at 7:24 a.m., 8 aircraft. Then, at 7:26 a.m., as the formation climbed above the cloud deck into the clear Arctic air and their radar cross-sections resolved more clearly on the E-2D's display, the final count, 10 Tu-22M3 Backfire bombers in a loose formation spread across 40 nautical miles of Barents Sea airspace, each carrying the Kh-22 Burya anti-ship missile, NATO designation AS-4 Kitchen, the supersonic, nuclear-capable, 6,000-kilogram weapon that represents the primary instrument of Russian naval aviation's anti-carrier doctrine, and that has been the subject of American Carrier Strike Group defensive planning since the weapon entered Soviet service in the 1960s. 10 Tu-22M3S, each carrying 2 Kh-22 missiles, a potential salvo of 20 supersonic anti-ship missiles, each traveling at Mach 4.6 in its terminal phase, each carrying a warhead that in its conventional configuration weighs 900 kilograms. This is the threat that the Barents Sea operating area was always about. This is what the Cold War era planners meant when they wrote about the anti-carrier threat. This is the scenario that shaped the Aegis Combat Systems design requirements, the SM-6's development program, and the E-2D's radar specifications. The Carrier Strike Group and the Tu-22M3-4s had been built over 5 decades of parallel development, specifically for this confrontation. Today, they were having it. The Link 16, data from the E-2D, was in the combat information centers of every ship in the strike group at 7:22 a.m. The moment of first classification, 71 minutes before the lead backfires could reach their estimated Kh-22 launch envelope. The Aegis combat system aboard USS Normandy began computing intercept solutions at 7:23 a.m., 1 minute after first detection, working through the engagement geometry of 10 large, fast aircraft closing from the northeast and computing the optimal allocation of its SM-6 and SM-2 inventory across the formation. The system's threat evaluation algorithm prioritized by arrival time at weapons employment range, assigning kill vehicles in the sequence that would achieve the highest probability of stopping the salvo before the first Kh-22 was released. The TAO aboard USS Normandy had the engagement picture at 7:23 a.m. and called his captain. The captain of USS Normandy arrived in his CIC at 7:25 a.m. He looked at 10 backfire contacts at 190 nautical miles, reviewed the Aegis Systems engagement recommendation, asked one question about the SM-6 inventory allocation, received a satisfactory answer, and authorized the defensive engagement posture. Then he told the TAO to coordinate with the strike group commander. who was in the Truman's CIC watching the same picture, and to ensure that the Air Wing's alert fighters were airborne and positioned before the Backfires reached their Kh-22 release envelope. 4 FA, A-18F, Super Hornets from VFA 32, the Swordsmen, were airborne from the Truman's flight deck at 7:31 a.m., launched into the gray Arctic overcast in pairs, climbing through the cloud ceiling into the clear air above where the contrails of the inbound Backfire formation were already visible as white threads against the dark northern sky. The Swordsmen carried AIM-1, 2, OD, AMR, AAMS, and AIM-9X sidewinders in their air-to-air configuration. Their mission, not the Kh-22 missiles, whose intercept was assigned to the surface-based Aegis systems, but the Backfire aircraft themselves, which the rules of engagement authorized engaging if they demonstrated hostile intent through weapons release. Now, let's talk about the Kh-22 Burya, because the weapon deserves a proper technical assessment before the discussion of what happens to it when it encounters an SM-6. The Kh-22 was designed in the Soviet Union beginning in the late 1950s, with full development completed in the early 1960s and operational deployment in the mid-1960s. It is a large missile, 6 meters long, 5,820 kilograms at launch, with a rocket motor that accelerates it to Mach 4.6 in the terminal phase, and a flight profile that takes it to 27,000 meters altitude in the cruise phase before diving toward its target at extreme speed. The original guidance system used inertial navigation combined with an active radar seeker in the terminal phase. The weapon was designed for one purpose: to defeat the defensive systems of American carrier battle groups by arriving too fast for interceptors to engage and too high for short-range weapons to reach during the cruise phase, then diving steeply at Mach 4.6 into the carrier's flight deck. That guidance philosophy was designed against 1960s American carrier defenses. It was a rational design for that threat environment. In 2024, the Kh-22's guidance system, inertial navigation with active radar terminal homing, faces a different problem. The SM-6's engagement envelope extends to altitudes of 33 kilometers and Mach 3.5 intercept speeds, meaning the Kh-22's 27,000-meter cruise altitude is within the SM-6's reach throughout the weapon's entire trajectory. The too high for interception design philosophy of the Kh-22 assumed that American interceptors would not be able to reach its cruise altitude. The SM-6 was specifically developed to eliminate that assumption. 60 years of American investment in exactly the right answer to the Kh-22's design logic. At 7:44 a.m., with the Backfire formation at 118 nautical miles and climbing to their Kh-22 release altitude, the lead Tu-22M3 activated its PNA targeting radar. The Leninet's PN aircraft fire control and navigation system that provides targeting data for the Kh-22's inertial navigation pre-launch programming. The radar emission was detected by the E-2D's electronic intelligence suite and classified immediately. Backfire targeting radar active, consistent with pre-launch Kh-22 targeting sequence. The same emission, replicated across multiple aircraft in the formation, told the American electronic intelligence picture one thing with complete clarity. The Backfires were preparing to fire. The lead swordsman pilot broadcast on the International Guard frequency at 7:46 a.m. The standard warning transmission to Russian military aircraft in international airspace, identifying his aircraft as U.S. Navy, advising the Backfire formation that they were being tracked, and noting that any weapons release would be treated as a hostile act with immediate and comprehensive defensive response. The transmission was professional in tone and completely clear in meaning. The Russian formation did not respond. The targeting radars continued their emissions. The formation continued its approach. At 7:51 a.m., the lead backfire reached its calculated Kh-22 release point, the specific position in space from which the missile's inertial guidance system could be programmed with sufficient accuracy to acquire the Truman's position on its active seeker in the terminal phase. The weapons bay doors opened. The Kh-22 separated from its launch pylon. Then the second aircraft in the formation released. Then the third. Within 90 seconds, all 10 Tu-22M3s had released their weapons. 20 Kh-22 missiles in the air, climbing to cruise altitude, their rocket motors burning, the weapons reaching 27,000 meters and turning south toward the American strike group 90 nautical miles away. 20 Kh-22 missiles at Mach 4.6, each one a 900-kilogram conventional warhead in a 5,820-kilogram delivery system. The weapons that had been designed to make American carrier strike groups obsolete. USS Normandy fired at 7:52 a.m. The SM-6 Block 1 missile is the U.S. Navy's primary long-range air defense weapon in the engagement envelope required for this threat. With a range of 370 kilometers and a maximum intercept altitude of 33 kilometers, the SM-6 was specifically developed to address the high-altitude, high-speed cruise missile threat that the Kh-22 represents. Its active radar seeker operates independently in the terminal phase. The launching ship does not need to maintain radar illumination of the target during the intercept, allowing the ship's radar to track other threats simultaneously. The SM-6's dual-role capability also allows it to receive mid-course updates from the E-2D's radar via the Cooperative Engagement Capability Data Link, meaning the missile is guided throughout its flight by the best available targeting data rather than solely by the launching ship's own sensors. SM-6 missiles came out of Normandy's VLS cells in a rapid sequential launch sequence. The distinctive sound and sight of the standard missiles leaving their canisters that the ship's crew had trained for but never experienced in live combat before this morning. The destroyers USS Forrest Sherman and USS Farragut added their own SM-6 launches to the intercept picture. The Aegis systems aboard all three ships coordinating their fires through the cooperative engagement architecture to avoid duplicated intercepts on the same target while ensuring every Kh-22 in the formation had an interceptor assigned. The E-2D's radar, elevated above the radar horizon that complicated surface ship tracking of high-altitude targets, was providing continuous track updates on all 20 Kh-22 missiles as they climbed to cruise altitude, its data feeding the SM-6's mid-course guidance systems with the precision required for high-altitude intercept. The first SM-6 intercept occurred at 7:56 a.m. at an altitude of 24,000 meters. The Kh-22, still in its cruise phase, its rocket motor burning, the weapon at its maximum altitude and most predictable trajectory. The SM-6's active seeker acquired the Kh-22's large radar cross-section at 15 kilometers range and guided to intercept. The 64-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead detonated in lethal proximity. The Kh-22, carrying 5,820 kilograms of missile structure and a full warhead, came apart in a fireball visible from the surface ships below as a brief bright flash above the overcast at 24,000 meters. The debris rained down into the Barents Sea 75 nautical miles north of the strike group. Second intercept. Third, the SM-6S were working through the Kh-22 formation in the cruise phase. The easiest intercept geometry, the target large, fast, but predictably so, flying a pre-programmed inertial trajectory without evasion. 4, 5, 6 Kh-22s destroyed in their cruise phase. 4 Kh-22 missiles survived the SM-6 cruise phase engagement and began their terminal dive. The dive profile, descending from 27,000 meters at Mach 4.6, is the most challenging intercept geometry in the engagement. The missile is accelerating, maneuvering, and presenting a rapidly changing aspect angle to the defending radar systems. The SM-6 inventory aboard the formation had been allocated with reserves specifically for this contingency, and the Aegis systems had SM-6 interceptors queued for the terminal dive engagements before the first dive began. 3 of the 4 diving Kh-22s were intercepted by SM-6 in the terminal phase at altitudes between 8,000 and 15,000 meters. The intercept geometry demanding but within the SM-6's proven engagement envelope. The 4th Kh-22, diving at Mach 4.6 toward the strike group, survived to 4,000 meters altitude before being engaged by the ESSM Block 2 in the inner defensive layer at 18 nautical miles range. The ESSM's 18-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead detonated close enough to the diving missile to destroy its guidance system and initiate the warhead prematurely. The resulting explosion at 3,800 meters altitude sent fragments into the Barents Sea 16 nautical miles north of USS Truman. No fragments reached the formation. 20 Kh-22 missiles. All 20 rendered inoperable or destroyed. 16 in the cruise phase by SM-6. 3 in the terminal dive by SM-6. 1 by ESSM Block 2. 0 impacts on American hulls. The swordsmen had been watching the entire engagement unfold from their orbit above the cloud deck. When the last Kh-22 was neutralized at 8:04 a.m., the 4 Super Hornets turned northeast toward the retreating Backfire formation. The Tu-22M3 their weapons expended, had turned for Olenya at maximum cruise speed. The swordsmen closed to visual range on the trailing element of the formation, 2 Backfires running northeast in afterburner, and maintained a position 2.5 nautical miles astern. No weapons were employed. No transmissions were required. The message was entirely in the geometry. 2 American fighters, weapons intact, following Russian bombers that had just expended their entire ordnance load against a carrier strike group that had not been touched. The swordsmen escorted the trailing Backfires for 42 nautical miles before breaking off and returning to the Truman. Both aircraft recovered aboard at 8:31 a.m. with their full weapons loadout. The Truman's flight deck crew cleared them in the standard recovery sequence and had both aircraft rearmed and refueled within 70 minutes. The Truman continued her Barents Sea operations for another 17 hours before beginning her transit south. The after-action report logged the following: SM-6 expenditure rate within projected parameters. ESSM Block 2 1 round expended, all other weapons intact, 0 casualties, 0 damage. The E-2D's electronic intelligence collection from the engagement, the complete emissions picture at 10 Tu-22M3 Backfires in a coordinated attack profile, including the PNA targeting radar emissions, the Kh-22's seeker activation sequence, and the communications traffic between the aircraft and their ground control was transmitted to the relevant intelligence commands within 4 hours of the engagement's conclusion. In Moscow, the Northern Fleet Command was writing the engagement report that nobody in that building wanted to write. Tu-22M3 had executed the textbook Kh-22 Mass Attack Profile against a carrier strike group that the fleet's intelligence assets had been tracking for 6 days. The attack had been coordinated, professionally executed, and delivered with the weapons and tactics that Russian naval aviation doctrine had developed over 60 years specifically for this mission. Every missile had been detected, tracked, and neutralized before a single one reached its target. The weapons that had defined Russian anti-carrier doctrine since the Cold War had been demonstrated to be insufficient against the specific defensive architecture the Americans had built to counter them. The Kh-22 was designed when the SM-6 did not exist. It was designed when the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye did not exist. It was designed when the cooperative engagement capability that fuses multiple ships' radar pictures into a single unified targeting solution did not exist. In the 60 years between the Kh-22's design and this engagement, the United States Navy had built all of those things specifically because the Kh-22 and weapons like it represented the most significant threat to carrier aviation that any adversary had deployed. The Kh-22 is still fast. It is still large. It still carries a warhead that would cause catastrophic damage to anything it reaches. It no longer reaches anything it is fired at, because the system built to stop it has been in development for 60 years and is now demonstrated in live operational conditions that it works. The Barents Sea is international water. The USS Harry S. Truman operated in it for 48 hours and departed on her own timeline, on her own course, at her own speed. The Northern Fleet watched her go. 20 Kh-22 missiles were somewhere on the bottom of the Barents Sea. The Truman was entirely intact. Bye for now.